So, this is the point in the series that I wasn't sure if this would be the last video or not, but it's a comparison of various forms of universal basic income and other basic income-like proposals. Because not all basic incomes are equal. So what are some other basic income-like proposals? Well, one of them is the guaranteed minimum income, which is often synonymous with basic income, but it is a little different. A guaranteed minimum income is a system of social welfare provisions that guarantees citizens or families have an income sufficient to live on, provided that they meet certain conditions. Eligibility for a guaranteed minimum income typically is determined by some kinds of means test. This is part of why it is different from a universal basic income. The universality of basic income is that there is no means testing. There's no need for oversight other than citizenship in a lot of cases, and also typically adulthood. There are some basic incomes that have provisions that include children in them, which I'm really interested in those. I do wonder if there might be room for abuse in that, but the part of me that thinks people are generally just trying to live says no. Basic income should be for everybody, but I understand if others hesitate about it. The differences from basic income to guaranteed income. Basic income means the provision of individual payments from a government to all of its citizens. Guaranteed minimum income is a system of payments, in some cases only one, by a government to citizens who fail to meet one or more means test. While most modern economies have some form of guaranteed minimum income, through some sort of social support net, basic incomes are rare. There are many people who have advocated for both minimum incomes and basic income. Often when you say guaranteed minimum income, you come up with certain people like Martin Luther King. Now, I don't have a copy of Chaos and Community, but from the things he said, from the interviews I've seen about it, and knowing what I do of his philosophy, I believe that what he meant by a guaranteed minimum income is a proper universal basic income. Some people can argue with me on that, that's fine, but that's how I see it. I believe that he meant a true basic income, not something means tested. Now, we covered welfare in the last video, and why means tests are bad. They are so flawed, and typically they require someone to already have hit the point where they're suffering before they are allowed to get assistance. That just, it goes against the very concept of what they are for me. For me, a safety net should be a net, not a ladder you have to grab onto and pull yourself out of the water before you drown. So, when I hear guaranteed minimum income, I typically hope that people mean a basic income, though when you get down to brass tacks, they are different. Now, what about negative income tax? What about tax accreditation and that sort of thing? That is typically brought up around basic income as well, because implementing a broad-reaching negative income tax can function like a basic income. Let's see here. If the government is willing to give cash to anybody below a certain earnings level, then a negative income tax may be an excellent approach. But that begs the question, if there are conditions, what should they be? Would the government treat a working pregnant mother the same way as an unemployed single individual? Should there be requirements to work? What about a requirement to acquire retraining when necessary? What about childcare? Does minimum wage or job availability change it? These all play into questions around negative income tax. A lot of people, when they think about negative income tax, think that it can be something relatively easy put together. And I agree that it should be. The theory of negative income tax should be really quick and easy to grasp. In fact, a lot of people get back something from the government after filing their taxes of a year. Many of us do not, but a lot of people do. Your tax return, it functions very much like a negative income tax. They're almost identical. In fact, as mentioned previously in the welfare commentary, a lot of tax accreditation that goes into your tax return is considered a form of welfare. They're considered part of that social assistance grouping. So, negative income tax has a lot of potential for acting as a basic income, especially if you made it properly universal and made it just a flat, this much is taken off of your earned income and everything else is returned back to you at the end of the year. This is slightly different from my preferred version of basic income because typically it would be segmented into a single payment in a year. And while I don't like the paternalistic, very curated versions of social assistance, I think that single lump sum payments have more flaws in them than consistent trickle payments. Partly because they're much more prone to impulse. If someone manages to get a hold of you in a bad situation, they might be much more able to take advantage if your money is coming to you in a big lump bundle. Essentially, I think that the negative income tax version of a basic income has more room for abuse and flaws. That might just be my reading. That might just be my understanding. But I think that it has more potential implementation problems than a monthly stipend does. Similarly, the citizens' dividend, as proposed by Thomas Paine, which consisted of only a couple of payments that were doled out during your lifetime to citizens, has that big lump sum flaw. That concept kind of resembles the idea of setting aside a bond for, say, a child that they acquire when they reach adulthood. There's plenty of people who would like to do that, who think it's wonderful, and I think that it's a nice idea. I embrace that idea. But comparing that kind of singular check to a continuous check, is very different, partly because while you had to wait to adulthood to get it, it has no measure for how long you're going to live. If you gave singular big lump sum payments that were equal across the board, then they would probably end up having a much more awkward effect over time. Because, well, if you got, say, several $1,000 all at once, it might give you a really great position to make some very powerful choices, but you might not have the experience or opportunity to really take advantage of it. And I feel getting it as a slower trickle that is continuous through your entire lifetime is more effective and less ripe to have negative consequences. So I keep coming back to the basic income of a monthly stipend of some sort being the most effective in my opinion. To be absolutely clear, that is my opinion. I am no economist. I did pass my economics class relatively well, and economics is mostly just understanding behavior versus incentive. But I'm no expert. And some of these various versions of universal basic income to an economist, these various forms end up coming out roughly the same in the wash. So some people might have a preference. Some people might prefer to get like $100,000 in a lump sum over a slow trickle of $1,000 odd a month. I understand that. I understand the inclination toward it. And in some cases, that might be the most helpful for some people. But I just don't think it's as broadly applicable. Some people might think that negative income tax is more appropriate than, say, giving out a stipend every month. Because when you talk about a stipend every month and it being truly universal, people see that the millionaires and billionaires are getting $1,000 a month as well. And it's really a question of and. As far as the math's concerned, there's no difference in getting $1,000 a month and having a negative on your taxed income of $12,000. Mathematically, it comes out to being the exact same thing. And millionaires and billionaires would get that because that would be the floor. It would be the starting point of earned income. So I'm not seeing this argument. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So your minimum income, your basic income, some people are still going to be a little adverse to it. They're going to say they just really don't like the concept of paying people to exist. They want them to have some kind of job. Okay, so you have to look at minimum wage. Minimum wage is presumably there in theory to prevent a certain amount of abuse from happening by businesses to their employees. So the problem with a minimum wage, which I think that we should have one, and I think that it should also be tied to cost of living and automatically increased. But the problem with comparing minimum wage to basic income is instead of putting the survival of your citizens and their well-being on the government, then you become dependent on companies. And there are problems with relying on businesses to do the right thing. That's why we have a minimum wage to begin with. And the problem with raising your minimum wage is that big businesses, unless you put in some kind of prerequisite that after a certain amount of wealth they increase their wage above the bare minimum, they really don't feel it, which forces small businesses to suffer the brunt of that. Which, in some ways, is fine. I'm okay with making businesses have to pay a living wage. But it makes it a lot harder for a business that's not already established or is right on the borderline of being able to make ends meet. It creates another barrier to entry that runs the risk of giving big overarching companies even more power, which I think is the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. A basic income would raise the minimum wage by creating a minimum wage that the government is paying to you to be a productive, healthy citizen in the country. There's also a question of, does the minimum wage do anything for people who have really obscure jobs? If you really want to compare basic income and minimum wage, then you need the government to start paying wages for people who do certain things, like to people who are full-time care providers for children, elderly, or disabled in their family. If you want to compare the two, then we need to start giving a stipend to people who do in-home work. Which, if we're going to go that route, why not just go with a universal basic income? Which will then give businesses who are paying wages more flexibility in what they can pay, while also giving people a minimum wage they can earn just for being, which will allow them greater bargaining power, and even runs the potential of empowering unions, because now people who feel that they want to unionize, or a union that wants to organize a strike, knows that the people involved are going to have this bare floor of basic income. You have to add so much on to minimum wage to really compare it to basic income that it's almost hard to do. And the same thing comes up with like a jobs guarantee. So if the government is going to guarantee you a job, what are they going to pay you to do? I'm for paying in-home work. Pay the people taking care of the sick, the elderly, and children. Pay them. But what else is a federal jobs guarantee going to be? Are they all going to be minimum wage only jobs? Are they all going to be in construction or data entry? Things that are relatively easy to automate at this point. I mean, have you seen the 3D printers that are literally printing buildings? True, most of them are not out in the public sector yet, but that's just a matter of time. And as far as data entry, as soon as it's in the computers can be programmed to do everything else. So when you look at a federal jobs guarantee, I like the spirit of it, but what is a job? What kind of jobs is it going to offer? What's going to count? Does the artist who's drawing murals for people get an additional stipend beyond the cost of beyond what they're paid for their art? Because if they don't, they're gonna have a very inconsistent income. And that creates problems and creates complications with the brokenness of our safety net. There are just basic income solves so many of the little flaws in other programs. Basic income comes in many forms, but long term, I have not come across a better form of basic income than a non-tested, consistent, slow trickle stipend. I like the concept of a once a month stipend so that it's easy to deliver, it's consistent, it comes every 30 days roughly, the first of every month. Or a once a week stipend. That works too. But consistency is part of what is required to achieving a proper basic income. It needs to be consistent, it needs to be non-means tested, and it needs to be responsive to changes in the economy, and that it should be a progressive thing. It should stay relatively level with cost of living. So any basic income should have, in its implementation, a gradual raise with changes to your cost of living so that it stays consistent and it's reliable. It's reliable, it's simple, it puts the burden on the group easiest able to compensate for it, and that is your overarching government. It doesn't negatively impact smaller businesses. It doesn't favor one person over another, even if the impact will be greater based on which percentage of your overall income it equates to. I find basic income is just a better solution, just a better implementation. My ideal is roughly once a month, puts you right at or poverty line, give or take a little bit, so that you know that generalized poverty is just not a thing anymore. Where you can easily say, well, if the only thing you want to do for money is just draw your basic income, then you are at the poverty line. It doesn't discriminate whatever kind of work you want to do. Whether that is just going to be a hobbyist or going back to school and becoming a nurse. It doesn't have judgments based on how you use your time. It eliminates so many of the other flaws seen in other programs. So, yeah. Universal basic income. I prefer it to all other options on the table. And there have been a couple of different versions of universal basic income proposed. Right now, there are a few different kinds that are being talked about, the most prominent being as the freedom dividend by Andrew Yang. I have a whole video on the freedom dividend that is actually going to end up being the last video of this series, because in it I ended up summarizing some of the other points I've made within these other videos. And the freedom dividend uses many of the same metrics that I prefer. So it's just going to be the last video. So That said, that's going to be the last video of this series, and it should be queued up for you next if you're watching the playlist. Bye.